I enjoyed the question because I wasn't the one who was planning to bring science to Stanford. You have to remember now I first heard about this, and it would have been probably in spring 1979. But maybe Myra Strober, who was the director of the Center for Research on Women that had been founded here at Stanford in 1974. And she put in a proposal. The Center for Women Research on Women at Wellesley was the other big proposal. So I was called to a meeting. No, it wouldn't have spring. It would have been fall 1979. Very late in the process of making a proposal. Myra called a meeting because there was a whole group of women faculty. We were the Center for Research on Women was our base. We had projects together, and I'd been involved in a big one, which was the project on Victorian women's lives. So that gave me interdisciplinary, and Catherine Simpson liked a paper I'd given probably in the 74, 75 MLA on the politics of androgyny. Androgyny was the buzzword then, and Catherine was one of the group. Well, I mean, my politics of androgyny was warning about hazards of this concept, and she liked that. So we'd met. So I had that connection. But otherwise, I was an under half-time lecturer in English. Okay. I'd stepped off the tenure track when my baby boy was 1, and at Stanford, I was a lecturer, under half-time, no benefits. But this women's group was not hierarchical. So women scholars in the area, and people like me who were kind of hanging on by their fingernails and so on, we were all part of a group that had projects. So I was invited to this meeting, and Myra put forward what the plan was. They wanted to make this proposal. But now, who would be on the team, who would be associates, and who would be the editor? And so, I mean, I was the only one there who was in English, I think, and I was the only one. The rest of them were women at Stanford in 1979 trying to get tenure. They couldn't take time to be editor. I was half-time. I was a mom, but Anne Malor in English, she went on, she was at that meeting. And she was very funny because she said, Barbara, you look like the wallflower at the dance who's asked by the prince to to the dance floor. So, and I guess I did, because here was a life, my God, So that's how. I didn't plan it. It happened to me. I mean, Myra had wonderful backing. At that point, I think the president of Stanford was Dick Lyman, and his wife was Jing Lyman, a powerhouse of a feminist who had helped Myra with other people, had started the Center for Research on Women. Jing was behind this, okay? So the word went forth, we're going to support this. But then one thing that Chicago then, because the journal follows the editor, Chicago did not want a situation where the editor lost her job. And right. I've been working year to year. That's what lecturers, a hat in hand, they have. So they said there has to be a guarantee that Barbara Gelpi will be 5 years at Stanford. And it went up to the director of graduate studies, who was, a colleague, but not a feminist by any means. But he had the word, and he was, yes, this was to happen. And so he said, yes, 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 you could have that guarantee. Um, and so then the other thing that happened, and this is how I got back on the tenure track, but science has to do with it, because in 1981 it would be, but I was already much more visible because of science. The University of Notre Dame offered us both. It offered me a full professorship, and it offered Al a full deanship with all kinds, and it, but he wouldn't have been able to work on the book he was writing on American poetry. Al, my dear husband, bless his heart, he said, I'll do this. If Stanford doesn't put you on the tenure track, we go to Notre Dame. I went straight from our interview at Notre Dame to New York, because by then, and with the MLA, and I was a big feminist then, by the science, all this stuff, again, science had everything to do with it. So I was going to be on the committee that looked at what articles should be accepted for possibilities of talkers. There was some MLA job that I had to do, and you're put up at a hotel, and Al phoned me after I'd had a day of reading articles and things. Al phoned me in the evening and said, okay, and now he was, besides being, he was what was called, he was an associate dean of a wonderful, Jerry Lieberman, a wonderful, wonderful director of graduate studies by that time. He could become the director, who was very much for science. He was very much with science, and very much for Al and me. And he worked out the plan. The English department was saying, and the head of the English department was saying, you're Catholics, you're going to go. And Al said, just think of an answer. But Jerry Lieberman, who's the one who came up with the answer, that I could be put on the tenure track half-time with 10 years then to make tenure. But but I needed that because science didn't count for, and I would have to write another book. But I couldn't write the book until I finished with science, which was going to be another 3 years. I got tenure as a full professor at Stanford when I was 59 years old. It was also the most productive, the most wonderful 5 years of my life. The culmination, and this was true, I noticed that I asked Estelle, the culmination for all of us, I think, was a special issue we did on communities of women. That I told you how it really, my presence at Science, the whole project came out of a community of scholarly women. We started as a community of women, and I'll read their names. I'll start with the staff. Claire Novak, an amazing managing editor, and Susan Johnson, who became a co-managing editor. They were both amazing. Then my associates, Estelle Friedman, in history, Carol Jacklin in psychology, Nan Cohane in political science, Shelley Rosaldo in anthropology, Myra Strober in economics, and Marjorie Wolf in anthropology. So there were 6 of them, and we would have these sessions where we'd brainstorm about what we do. Now, so now several of them, Shelley Rosaldo died tragically in 1981 in an accident, as you know. And Nan Cohane happily went to Wellesley and then to Duke, and Carol Jacklin went to USC. So we added a couple more. Jane Collier and Sylvia Yanagisako were who were there with the rest of us by 1985. But that sense of it being that we would make our decisions as a group, and that we would not, and it would not be hierarchical. The staff was there for these, and actually, one staff, Susan Johnson, was an editor with the lesbian issue, and Claire Novak was was an editor in the poverty issue, women's poverty. So that's what, and what we built up to was a conference held here on communities of women at Stanford, and I see there was 1983, and then we had a special issue with essays from that conference in I think it was the last year in 1985. Anyway, that sense of working within a community was part of what made it, but also the interdisciplinary work. My answer to that is, and it's what we thought at the time. I don't think so now, really. But what we thought was the issue in which we had to have translated a group of essays on French feminist theory. And each of those on very complicated feminist theory, each of those essays had to be translated. And then there were these factions in France, there were factions among the feminists there. And we had Hélène Sixou of one faction on the board, but then the other faction, I forget, that was extremely angry about that, and we had to meet with them and so on. So when I first went to New York to be trained in signs, I mean, I had like 2 days, 3 days, but one of the things that Catherine Stimson said very proudly was that they had there as something that we could use was an essay by Julia Kristeva. I wasn't about to say, and who's that? But then Julia Kristeva became a force in my life. And so for me, when I came out of science, I'd been going to write a book on Shelley and his mother, and I'd written many chapters of it, and I just trashed it and started all over with Kristeva and the maternal and French theory. So it was important, but I think now, I mean, I then learned all that theory, but mostly I learned it in the year after I left science. There wasn't time. So I had as my guru, Kaja Silverman, the subject of semiotics. And I still often use a phrase she had when she gets to someone like Lacan. She says, she talks about a system whose very rigors seduce, that to make tenure in the 1980s and 90s, I had to know this stuff. And indeed, when I went back as a more like a professor in the English department, untenured, but on the tenure track, I was given courses in feminist theory and it was taken. I knew my stuff, and I did, but those courses were very fraught because the theory stems from male theorists who are so finally misogynist. The greatest pride was, again, that science was a shaping force in healing a rift that existed in the 70s between heterosexual feminists and lesbian feminists. There was a kind of distrust between the two. Now, I was a hetero, obviously, and I was a very, very close friend of Adrienne Rich. So, and I forget, there was one time Adrienne called to tell us she was in love, and both Al and I thought, we wouldn't ask whether it was, we took it was a woman, you know. In other words, so I was, and Estelle Friedman, who was a very dear, close friend. So I don't think the rift applied to me. That is, say, I was a good one for bridging the gap. I could help that way. But I thought it was telling that in 1980, I went to my first National Women's Studies conference when I had to. Now, this would have been before, that was spring 1980. So before, because science was sort of in the process of coming here, I was again learning how much I didn't know. And at that meeting, though, I've heard later that the lesbians and the heteros were housed separately, you know. And that, but by the 1982 meeting, which was in Arcata, was at Humboldt State in Arcata, California. That was a coming together. Estelle was beside herself with joy. It was such a coming together of awareness that we all had a group project here. There was not any daylight between hetero and lesbian feminists. We were what that was, and then signs, though it is an answer to this, it was still considered daring, and as they were considered daring, that signs had a special issue. Again, with Estelle and Susan Johnson and myself as editors of something called the lesbian issue, and there was, with deliberate pun on the word issue, so that it was still, but that's the way, in that way, I think that the signs at the time it was at Stanford really did shape women's studies and feminist thinking and feminist action. Again, another place it comes up in signs. Now I'm forgetting, I think it's about 1984. It's early. There was an essay by Susan Friedman on HD, Hilda Doolittle,
Yep.
Adrienne Rich,
Yep.
Intertextuality, I think is good.
Yep.
I think it's in that essay that no, I know, I'm pretty sure I know it because we published it, but it has in it some comment about the fact that Adrienne Rich, who was teaching one course a year at Stanford, maybe I think two, one in feminist studies, one in the English department. And in the feminist studies course, she had made it uncomfortable, if not impossible, for men to be part of that. I was sitting in the science office, and here suddenly the phone rang. Here on the phone is a beloved voice, but not, but giving me the tiger paw. What? What is this? What is science doing publishing this? And so, but I gave the editorial answer. Now, Adrienne, and we publish, you know, but we welcome comments, and they did have, then there was a comment between herself. She has a beautiful line. If they call me man hater, you would have known it for a lie. And so I think that she found a response like that very hurtful. So I asked, there are three colleagues still alive, Myra Strober, Nan Quinn, I think Myra Strober, Nan Quinn, and Estelle Friedman are still alive, very much alive. And I'm very much in touch with them. So I got in touch with them, and I sent them all these questions. So the only one I got an answer to the questions I got, they all sent back saying, you'll do fine, do it, that's great, you know. So, but this is Estelle's answer. Now the question is, what frustrates you as
Yep.
an Indian about feminism? What makes you about feminist scholarship today? What makes you happiest? Now, she didn't answer to frustrate. She
Okay.
said happy, greater diversity, intersectionality. And then she says, exact, more complex and fluid understandings of gender. The issue that we weren't looking at was the women of color issue, of course, the key book. And it's like, do you remember where you were? I remember where I was when I opened this bridge called my back. And so that's, I see it was early 1981. I was in the signs and I sat absolutely mind boggled and ashamed and made aware. Still, this bridge called my back told me things that in a way Adrienne had been talking about, but that I hadn't heard in the same way or something. It was news. There was a way in which it's embarrassing, but it was news. And then I noticed, I looked up for this, like at the 1982 NWSA meeting in Storrs, Connecticut, University of Connecticut. I see that, I forget the title now, but it was on race, on feminism and how we must consider racial issues. And it, and this bridge called my back is sort of really part of what leads to that, is central. But it didn't take care of it, because I remember, and I think it was at the Rutgers, it's the 1984, and that's pretty soon before the 1984 meeting was a very, very, again, I'd learned by that time, because I'm really, really not a confrontational person. I'm a Canadian originally, I'm Canadian and convent bred, and confrontation doesn't come naturally to me at all. Though having a position does, but being quiet about it. Anyway, I'm not confrontational, but I did learn to be better. I did learn when necessary. Confrontation with a really difficult topic is a moral necessity. Now, signs, and to get to your theme of, in my editorship, did signs help at all with this question? I think we did help some, but it was too little. It was too late. But we did something, and that was, we did have in the very last issue of Signs a symposium that, and Bonnie Thornton Dill was on it, and I think she helped to organize it. That was on sort of, and the whole, I don't have the title right, but it was really about gatekeepers in feminist academe. Signs strong among the gatekeepers, and that the gatekeepers were not opening the gate to these issues. That's the best the most we managed out of that, on that side of the big problems that were among women. I think that there was a constant struggle to work with our differences, which were very real, because we haven't even talked about the differences between the Marxist feminists and the liberal feminists, on those economic differences. But we were struggling to come to some place we could be together. Because, and in my looking at things as part of this, I was thinking about Phyllis Schlafly, 1980, Reagan won, Signs came to Stanford, Reagan won the election. Phyllis Schlafly, who is going to make it impossible to ratify the ERA, and who is beginning the work of unraveling Roe versus Wade that had just been passed. She was a horror to me. I mean, she was a nightmare figure.
Yeah.
And she hasn't gone away. She died. I see. And I think 2016. And that shows what we were up against outside. So the Marxists and the liberals can argue here, and the lesbians and the heteros can argue here. But we had a common, and well, you have to say enemy, something we had to fight that was really just highly destructive to women's lives, all
Well,
women's lives. And it's hard not to feel discouraged. The arc of the moral universe is on. I do think we are moving. It is better. There is, and that Estelle Friedman says she's happy, and that's good. And that's I believe her. So that's good. That's good. But when you look, and you just hear the news, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard.